Hello YouTube! Alright, so as many of you probably already know, I run a webcomic that I publish every week called Heartless. I won't go into too much detail about the comic itself here, but I will link it below. And this video is the process of drawing one page from start to finish. So there are a few steps that I go through for every page that I haven't shown here. First off, I write a script. I planned and wrote out almost the entire comic before I started drawing anything, and then I'll go back and make edits to that whenever I start a new chapter. Secondly, I always start with a paper thumbnail. I'll do usually somewhere between 9 and 12 to a page, depending on how many I fit, and I'll make little tiny drawings with the placement of panels and the rough expressions. These are really basic. They're pretty much no better than stick figures, so I didn't feel a need to include that step here because I don't usually scan them in. Anyways, once I have those steps done, I start doing what you see here, which is first making a very rough picture of what I want the entire page to look like, and then going over it again with a slightly darker color and a new layer to get a better idea of exactly what sorts of poses and expressions I want my characters to be making. This is especially useful because a lot of pages tend to have fairly complicated anatomy and poses, and it's easier for me to kind of do that in the two steps of first getting the general idea across and then getting across the refinements in a second layer. So once I'm happy with the sketch, which I draw in Paint Tool Sci, I export the file as a JPEG and then I import it into another program, and that's Mango Studio Debut 4. The recording I've done here unfortunately doesn't show the tools I'm using. I forgot to set those on the same screen so they'd record together, but I'm not really an expert on the program anyways, so I don't think you're missing out very much. I have a set list of tool parameters I use for the entire comic, and I just have those written out on a little slip of paper that I keep next to my computer, and that makes sure that I'll always keep the things like the panel thickness and the text fonts and the width of the speech bubbles to be roughly the same through the entire comic, even though it's going to be a project that takes me many years. I will sometimes make slight changes to that, like in the text fonts, mostly either to fit in a very long piece of dialogue or to show some sort of extra emphasis, like I'll do larger text when someone's yelling or smaller text when they're speaking very quietly. As you can probably also see here, I do tend to do a little bit of editing of my script just as I'm pasting it in. It's one of the advantages of being both the writer and the illustrator for a comic, is I don't need to go through any sort of approval process if I want to make something a little bit different than initially planned, so I'll often have some pretty significant changes happening between the first script that I start with and what actually ends up going to the page. Things like cutting out sentences if I find that someone's speaking too much, or adding in extra words if I find that I haven't explained something as thoroughly as I want to, or even just if I feel the page needs a little bit more text to look balanced. Once I'm happy with the text and the dialogue bubbles, the page goes back into Paint Tool Sci. That's the program I use for almost all my artwork. The inking process I use for comics is usually a lot rougher than it would be for a finished piece I was planning for a print or for a commission. I kind of have this opinion that a comic that's kind of alright but is finished is better than a comic that's absolutely perfect but never going to get done. Publishing comics on a weekly schedule, especially with a passion project like Heartless, takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So quite often I'll make sure that a panel is good enough, and then I'll move on to the next one. There are a few exceptions to this where I feel that a particular page or a particular panel in a page really needs that kind of extra mile to make the story work, but for the most part I leave things just a little bit rougher and a little bit looser than I might in other situations. Yeah, so this is basically just the inking process. I do each panel individually and move on from one to the next. Sometimes I'll do all the figures first and then fill in the backgrounds later, and sometimes I'll kind of draw them all together. It sort of depends on how much interaction there are between the two and what I'm feeling like doing at the moment, which is mostly just how much I feel like procrastinating on drawing the backgrounds. For me, the one thing I really do try and get right with every panel is the character's expressions. I think that silent panels, like a lot of the ones here, are one of the most powerful and useful tools you have in storytelling when you're doing a visual medium like a webcomic. And I really want to make sure that the way my characters are feeling is being expressed as accurately as I can. Things like the props in the background or the clothing the character is wearing, those can get a little bit more off model and it's not really a huge problem. But if I've given the character an expression that looks incorrect, it's going to change the entire meaning of the page I'm drawing. And that's usually something I want to avoid. You can see here that there's a few sound effects that I added in the sketch stage that I'm not actually going to end up transferring over into the line art. That was mostly a decision to keep things a little bit more subtle. I'm not really personally a huge fan of using a lot of sound effects in my work. I find it tends to lend a kind of superhero-ish almost vibe. Maybe that's just the way I'm using them. But there's something I kind of try and avoid using unless I absolutely can't do otherwise. And I felt that once I was finished inking this page, that Clara's expression was mostly doing a good enough job at getting that across. I also ended up moving the knocking sound effect over to the next page. That's, I guess, a little bit of a spoiler for next week, just because I felt that it would give a better sense of pacing if I added that in with the panels that are coming up next. Alright, the next step up is coloring, and I do apologize because I've sped up the video even faster here and it might end up feeling a little choppy to watch. I color by object, so I'll do skin first and then hair and then outfits and then all the little various accessories, and I keep everything on a separate layer as I'm going. I keep Clara's main colors, that's her skin, her hair, and her eyes, just on a little scratch palette that Paint Tool Sci gives you as an option. And if I've got a chapter coming up with another main character in a starring role, I'll add their colors to that as well. But for things like clothing or backgrounds, I'll just open up an older page, as you can see me doing throughout here, and I'll copy those colors in from there. Copying colors from a previous page is a nice, easy way for me to get color accuracy and color consistency without ever having to make a big, detailed, full-colored reference shot that I can go back to time and time again. The only potentially frustrating part of using this method is quite often I'll actually have to open up 2 or 3 separate pages because all of the objects I'm using might not necessarily show up at once. But I still think it's easier than having to come up with a big full reference image for every single location I include. The coloring on this page actually went quite quickly, just because I had already designed almost every element I was using. I think the only new object to show up was the little mirror that Clara has, so I didn't need to make any actual decisions about color. I just had to go back, grab the colors, and then import them into the new image. And then the last bit you'll see me doing here is all the details like her face and eyes. I usually tend to draw those in last because they require a little bit more work than the just dropping in colors. So I'll take that as a little bit of a break and then go back to the actual drawing part. Once I get to shading, I'm once again usually pulling up old pages and copying in the colors from there. When I have a brand new environment, I'm generally using the same color picking cheat method that I showed in a previous tutorial video, and I will try and use YouTube's fancy new card system to give you a link to that on the side somewhere here. But it's usually a lot easier when I've got a page set in a previous environment, because then I can just go back and copy the colors I was using before. I usually shade the same way I'm showing here, which is shading every single layer individually, but I do change up that method when I'm working in a very dark environment, when the characters are in a very dark environment. I can then usually get away with cheating and using a single overlay layer on top of all of my character layers and filling that in with a color that's appropriate to the background and setting it, as I said, to overlay or to multiply depending. That's really about it for this page in particular. Just a few other notes about my process in general. I tend to work several weeks in advance of posting. That's usually about 8 weeks, but right now it's closer to 4 because I've fallen a little bit behind. The buffer that I create there is very useful for about 3 big reasons. First off, I'm actually working on usually 2 to 4 pages at once and doing all those pages together. So I'll do 2 to 4 sketches, then 2 to 4 sets of line art, 2 to 4 sessions of just doing flat colors, and then 2 to 4 sessions of shading. And that ends up helping me streamline the process because I can get into the groove of doing one thing and just do it over and over and over again. Secondly, there are weeks sometimes when I'm not able to work on Heartless at all, and having the buffer means I don't need to post in random little hiatuses for everything that comes up. So if I'm sick or if I've got a major convention to prepare for, I can continue to post my pages reliably. And thirdly, when you're doing a big webcomic, you'll definitely run into cases where certain pages are going to be either very, very easy or very, very difficult. And when you're doing it several pages at once and with a long buffer, it lets you spread out your workload a little bit more evenly, and it gives you time to do that extra work that your comic is really going to need when it turns out that you're really going to need it. So, for example, back in Chapter 4, I had one page that required a very detailed, full painterly style image for one of the panels that took me longer than 2 or 3 other pages combined. And I think it really added to the story, but I wouldn't have had the time to do that if I was just doing this one page drawn every single week and then posted at the end of the week. Yeah, I think that's about it. If you're an artist and you're thinking about starting a webcomic, or you've just started one and you've got some questions, I would be absolutely happy to try and answer them. Just leave them in the comments down below. I don't know if I'm exactly a comic expert, but I've been doing this for a few years now, and I'd love to share what I've learned if it can be of any help. If you have any other questions about drawing, again, just leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.